Jesus Christ made the rich man pay for shutting the church doors on a barefoot elderly woman, and silence fell completely. The wooden doors of St. Raphael Parish slammed shut just as dawn brushed the sky with pale gray light. On the cold stone steps, a barefoot elderly woman froze, her hands still lifted as if prayer itself had been cut in half. Inside the church, conversations died mid-breath. A sudden, unnatural stillness spread through the sanctuary, heavy enough to make chandeliers stop swaying and throats go dry. From the front pew, the rich man adjusted his tailored suit, convinced he had restored order. Tourists sat straighter. The organist hesitated, fingers hovering above the keys. Even the priest paused, unsettled by a silence that felt wrong, too deep, too complete. Outside, the woman lowered her head, pressing her wounded feet against the frozen stone, whispering a prayer meant only for heaven. No one noticed the wind stop moving through the nave. No one noticed how the candles refused to flicker. It was as if the building itself had drawn a breath and refused to let it go. The rich man felt it, then a pressure in his chest, a quiet fear he could not name. For the first time, his power felt thin, fragile, almost borrowed. Somewhere between the locked door and the altar, an unseen line had been crossed. And in that suspended moment, before judgment, before mercy, one truth settled over everyone present. When the doors of God's house are shut to the least among us, heaven does not shout. It goes completely silent. The woman's name was Grace Holloway, and at 73, Payne had learned her address by heart. She stood alone on the church steps long after the doors closed, the chills seeping through the thin soles of her feet and climbing into her bones. To anyone passing by, she might have looked like another forgotten figure in a historic town, small, bent, easy to overlook. But inside her chest, a storm of fear and faith wrestled for breath. Grace had not come for shelter. She had not come to ask for money. She had come to pray. That morning, her granddaughter Sophie lay at home burning with fever, her small body shaking through the night. 3 days, no doctor, no insurance, only whispered prayers and damp claws pressed against a child's forehead. Grace had promised Sophie she would go to church at dawn, that she would kneel before the altar and ask Jesus Christ to listen. Now she knelt on cold stone instead. Inside the sanctuary, no one saw her lower, herself carefully joints, aching breath shallow. No one saw her fingers tremble as they wrapped around a worn rosary, each bead polished smooth by decades of desperate hope. Her lips moved silently, not in anger, not in accusation, but in pleading. She did not ask why life had been so hard. She did not ask for fairness. She asked only that her granddaughter would live. A young man passing through the courtyard slowed his step. He recognized her. Everyone did. Grace was the woman who shared food when she barely had enough, the woman who watched neighborhood children when their parents worked double shifts. He wanted to help, to say something, but the closed doors loomed behind him like a warning. He kept walking, shame tightening his jaw. Inside the church, Father Thomas continued preparing for Mass. He told himself the woman would be fine. God could hear prayers anywhere. That was true, wasn't it? Still, the image of bare feet on stone crept into his thoughts, unwelcome and persistent. He pushed it aside and adjusted his stole. Grace pressed her forehead to the door once more, not to demand entry, but to steady herself. Her breath fogged the wood. "I know I am not clean," she whispered. "I know I am not presentable. But you are my God, too." Her voice broke, then steadied. Faith had taught her how to stand, even when dignity was stripped away. The morning light crept higher, casting long shadows across the steps. Grace remained praying through hunger, through cold, through the familiar ache of being unseen. What she did not know, what no one inside the church yet understood, was that heaven had heard every word. And when the prayer of the weakest rises from the ground, it does not disappear into silence. It waits. Victor Langford had arrived early, as he always did. The marble floor echoed beneath his polished shoes as he walked the center aisle of St. Raphael Parish, hands clasped behind his back, like a man inspecting his own estate. In many ways, it was exactly that. The new roof bore his name on a plaque. The stained glass restoration had been paid for by his foundation. Even the imported lilies near the altar had been approved by him personally. From the sacristy doorway, a volunteer watched him pass, lowering his eyes out of habit. Victor carried authority the way other men carried keys, confident, casual, unquestioned. At 58, he was the most successful hotel developer in the region, a man whose donations kept the parish solvent and respectable. People spoke his name softly with gratitude or caution, depending on where they stood. He paused near the front pew and scanned the sanctuary. Everything was in order. The church looked exactly the way it should, clean, dignified, worthy of the guests who would soon fill the benches. Tourists, investors, donors, people who understood how sacred places were meant to look. From outside came the faint sound of movement on stone. Victor turned sharply toward the doors, irritation flashing across his face. He had already dealt with this. He remembered the woman barefoot, hunched, stubborn in her presence. He had seen her too many mornings lingering where she did not belong, lowering the tone of a place built on beauty and reverence. "She can't come in like that," he said aloud, more to the room than to anyone in particular. A young staff member nearby shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Victor straightened his cufflinks and continued, his voice calm, decisive. "This is a church, not a shelter. People come here to be uplifted, not confronted with disorder." When the doors opened briefly, letting in a blade of cold air, Victor stepped forward. He saw her again. Grace Holloway, small against the towering wood feet, bare eyes, hopeful in a way that irritated him. Hope without contribution, faith without polish. He shut the door firmly. Inside, he exhaled, satisfied. Order restored. Victor did not see cruelty in the act. He saw management, standards, boundaries. He told himself that God valued excellence, that reverence required structure, that generosity had limits. If rules bent for one person, they would collapse for everyone. That was how chaos began. From the altar, the priest hesitated, watching Victor return to his seat. Their eyes met briefly. Victor's expression left no room for discussion. "This is my responsibility," his look seemed to say. "My church, my burden to carry." As he sat in the front pew, Victor felt the familiar comfort of control settle around him. He had worked too hard to build this life to let it be undermined by sentiment. He had climbed from nothing, fought his way into rooms where no one wanted him, learned the price of appearing weak. He would not go backward now. Around him, the church remained quiet, too quiet. The hum of preparation felt strained, as if the walls themselves were holding something back. Victor dismissed the sensation, crossing his arms with quiet confidence. Outside, an old woman remained on the steps. Inside, a powerful man believed he had done the right thing. Neither yet understood that the moment he claimed ownership of God's house, the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. The bells rang softly as the first notes of the opening hymn drifted through St. Raphael Parish. Worshippers rose from their seats. Coats straightened, voices blended into a practiced harmony. The church looked alive again, filled, orderly, respectable. From the front pew, Victor Langford bowed his head at the right moments, his posture reverent, his expression composed. At the altar, Father Thomas Keegan began the Mass with measured calm. His voice carried easily through the sanctuary, steady and warm. He spoke of love as a commandment, not a suggestion. He quoted scripture about welcoming the stranger, about seeing Christ in the poor, about mercy being the true measure of faith. Heads nodded. Some parishioners murmured, "Amen." Yet even as the words rose, something felt misaligned, like a melody played a half step off. Near the side aisle, Ethan Brooks stood holding a stack of hymnals. He tried to focus on the reading, but his eyes kept drifting to the doors. He knew who sat outside on the steps. He could picture her, exactly Grace's shoulders, hunched against the cold, her lips moving in prayer, her bare feet pressed against stone. Each verse about compassion landed in his chest like a quiet accusation. Father Thomas felt it too. As he preached, the phrases came out smoothly, but his heart lagged behind them. "Love your neighbor as yourself," he said, then paused just long enough for the words to echo back at him. He knew the neighbor those words were pointing to. He knew exactly where she was. His gaze flickered toward Victor, then away. The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Victor listened attentively, hands folded, eyes forward. He agreed with the message in theory. Charity mattered. Compassion mattered. But there was a time and a place. Order mattered too. Appearances mattered. He told himself that generosity had to be guided, curated, protected from abuse. The sermon to him was about ideals, not interruptions. Outside, Grace heard the muffled sound of singing through the thick doors. The melody reached her in fragments softened by wood and distance. She did not feel anger. She did not feel rejected by God. She simply felt tired. She pressed the rosary into her palm and whispered the same prayer again, slower now, as if each word needed extra strength to rise. Inside, the congregation knelt. Father Thomas lifted the chalice, his hands steady, his voice solemn. The ritual unfolded perfectly, but the air felt thinner than before, stretched tight between what was said and what was done. When the priest spoke of Christ breaking bread with the outcast, Ethan swallowed hard. When he spoke of the church as a refuge for the weary, several parishioners shifted uncomfortably. Victor remained still. No one stood up. No one opened the door. The Mass continued, beautiful and intact, yet hollow at its core. Outside, a prayer rose from the steps without amplification, without witnesses, without polish. And though it carried no microphone and stirred no applause, it traveled farther than anyone inside could imagine, toward a heaven that was listening very closely. Silence has a way of spreading when no one challenges it. In the narrow hallway beside the sanctuary, Ethan Brooks stood with his back against the wall, fingers clenched around the edge of a hymn book he had stopped reading minutes ago. He told himself there were rules. He told himself he was just a volunteer, that speaking up would only cost him the little stability he had. Yet with every passing second, the image of bare feet on frozen stone pressed harder against his conscience. Near the sacristy, Father Thomas Keegan removed his vestments in careful practiced motions. Each fold of fabric felt heavier than the last. He replayed the sermon in his mind, every word about mercy echoing back like a question he had failed to answer. He could have said something. He could have opened the door. Instead, he had chosen the safety of procedure over the risk of compassion. The thought settled in his chest like ash. A few pews away, a well-dressed couple exchanged glances. They had noticed the tension, sensed that something was off. The woman almost leaned toward the aisle as if considering a step forward, but the moment passed. The music resumed. The crowd followed the rhythm. It was easier to blend in than to stand out. Victor Langford felt the quiet differently. To him, silence meant agreement. No objections, no disruptions. Order maintained. As long as no one spoke, his decision remained unquestioned, his authority intact. He mistook the absence of resistance for righteousness, never noticing how unease moved through the room like a slow, invisible current. Outside, Grace Holloway remained seated on the steps, unaware of the debates unfolding behind closed doors. She did not know how many chances people had to help her and chose not to. She only knew that prayer was something no one could take from her. When her knees began to ache, she shifted slightly and continued whispering Sophie's name with each breath. Inside the church, people passed by the doors without looking at them. Each step, each glance away, became a small decision to stay comfortable, to stay uninvolved, to stay silent. And with every decision, the distance between faith and action grew wider. Ethan finally turned toward the doors, taking a half step forward. His heart pounded. He imagined opening them, imagined Grace looking up in surprise. He imagined Victor's reaction, the consequences that would follow. His foot hesitated, then retreated. The doors remained closed. The Mass ended. Polite conversations resumed. Smiles returned. Yet beneath the surface, something had fractured. The silence that filled St. Raphael Parish was no longer neutral. It had chosen a side. And in that collective quiet woven from fear, convenience, and deference, an unseen verdict was forming. Not against the barefoot woman on the steps, but against everyone who knew what was right and allowed it to remain undone. The decision came quietly, the way cold things often do. After the last parishioner drifted out of St. Raphael Parish, Victor Langford stood near the doors with his phone in hand, scrolling through images he had taken earlier that week. One of them froze on the screen, a small, hunched figure on the steps, barefoot, head bowed. He frowned not with guilt, but with irritation. To him, the image was not a human being. It was a problem. "This can't keep happening," he said, breaking the lingering hush. Father Thomas Keegan looked up from the sacristy doorway. His shoulders tensed. He already sensed where this was going. "She's just an elderly woman who wants to pray," he said carefully. "She isn't hurting anyone." Victor didn't look at him. "She's hurting the image," he replied. "People come here expecting beauty order. They donate because this place feels elevated, not desperate." From the corner of the room, Ethan Brooks listened, his stomach tightening. He felt like a witness to something he didn't want to hear spoken out loud. Victor tapped his screen and turned it toward them. I've contacted a security company. Cameras at the entrance and around the steps. If she shows up again, security will handle it. The words landed heavy. Father Thomas swallowed. Victor, this is a church. That's exactly why it needs protection. Victor cut in. If we let this slide, others will follow. Soon it won't be a parish, it'll be a shelter. And when donors stop coming, this place shuts down. Is that what you want? The priest lowered his gaze. The argument was familiar, practical, irrefutable on paper. He hated how easily it worked. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. He imagined cameras watching the steps where Grace prayed. Imagined her being told to leave by someone paid to enforce rules she never knew existed. His silence tasted bitter. Victor straightened his jacket, already moving on. I'll take care of it, he said. We need to be proactive. Keep things presentable. That night, as Victor drove home through quiet streets, he felt a flicker of satisfaction. Control had been restored. Problems, anticipated solutions implemented. This was what leadership looked like. He told himself he was protecting the church from decay, from disorder, from embarrassment. Outside his office window the next morning, workers installed discreet black domes above the entrance. Small, unblinking eyes pointed at the steps. Few people noticed. Fewer questioned it. Across town, Grace Holloway woke before dawn as she always did. Sophie's fever had not broken. Grace wrapped her thin coat tighter and prepared to walk back to the church. She did not know cameras had been mounted. She did not know her prayers had been categorized as a nuisance. She only knew that Jesus Christ had always met her where she knelt. Back at St. Raphael Parish, the door stood closed and polished frame perfectly beneath the new lenses. The church looked flawless from the outside, secure, curated, untouched by need. Inside, an unseen line had been crossed again. This time not with a shout or a slammed door, but with a quiet decision to watch compassion from a distance rather than practice it. And somewhere beyond the reach of those cameras, a reckoning began to gather its breath. The collapse did not arrive with thunder. It came with a phone call. Victor Langford was seated behind the glass desk of his largest hotel, reviewing occupancy charts that had always obeyed him. The numbers looked strong. Bookings were full. Everything appeared intact. Then his assistant stepped in, pale, holding the receiver, as if it were heavier than it should be. "It's the bank," she said. "They said it's urgent." Victor took the call with irritation still clinging to his voice. Within seconds, it drained away. The words were precise, clinical: irregularities, frozen accounts, an internal review. His signature appeared on documents that no longer told the truth. A credit line, one he had relied on to keep multiple properties afloat, had been suspended without warning. The voice on the other end did not argue, did not negotiate. It informed. When the call ended, Victor remained seated, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to nothing. The office felt smaller. The glass walls reflected a man he barely recognized, still well-dressed, still composed, yet suddenly weightless, as if the ground beneath him had thinned. He called his accountant next, straight to voicemail, again and again. By afternoon, the ripple became a wave. Vendors stopped deliveries. A restaurant manager called about payroll. A hotel supervisor mentioned cancellations. Each call peeled away another layer of certainty. Victor moved through the corridors, answering with rehearsed calm, but something inside him had begun to fracture. That evening, the news broke locally. Prominent developer under investigation. The headline spread faster than explanations ever could. Partners hesitated. Friends went silent. Invitations vanished. At St. Raphael Parish, Ethan heard whispers after evening prayer. Names spoken carefully, glances exchanged. He thought of the cameras watching the steps and felt an unease he couldn't name. Father Thomas read the article alone in the rectory, hands folded tightly. He closed his eyes, not in relief, but in dread. He wondered whether this was consequence or coincidence, and whether the difference mattered. Across town, Grace Holloway knelt beside Sophie's bed, pressing a cool cloth to the child's forehead. She did not know anything about frozen accounts or missing accountants. She only knew the fever still burned and that she would return to the church again in the morning. Faith to her had never been transactional. Victor did not sleep that night. He paced his house, passing rooms filled with expensive art that now felt ornamental, useless. Every time his phone buzzed, his chest tightened. Control, the thing he trusted most, was slipping through his hands. By the end of the week, the truth surfaced. His accountant had fled, leaving Victor exposed and liable. The damage was done. The mechanisms Victor had depended on for years turned against him with perfect efficiency. No lightning struck. No voice thundered from the sky. Just systems locking doors, closing accounts, going dark, modern judgment delivered without spectacle. And as Victor stared at the city lights from his office window, watching the life he built dim, one connection at a time, a question he had long avoided finally rose, uninvited and relentless. When everything that defined him was taken away, what if anything would remain? The meeting happened when Victor Langford least expected it, and when he had nowhere left to stand above anyone. The cafe was nearly empty, tucked between brick storefronts Victor had once helped renovate. He ordered coffee he barely tasted and sat alone, staring at his reflection in the dark window. For the first time in decades, no one was calling him for approvals. No one was asking for favors. The silence felt unfamiliar, almost threatening. "Mind if I sit?" The voice was calm, unassuming. Victor looked up. The man standing there appeared ordinary, mid-40s. Simple white shirt, worn jeans, no watch, no signs of importance. His presence didn't demand attention yet. It held it effortlessly. Something about his eyes made Victor uneasy, as if they weren't looking at him, but through him. "Go ahead," Victor said, guarded. The man sat, wrapping his hands around a cup of coffee that had not been there moments earlier. He smiled, not politely but gently, the way someone does when they already know the ending of a story. "You've been losing a lot lately," the man said. Victor stiffened. "Everyone knows that." "Losing things," the man continued, unbothered, "or letting go of things that were never really yours." The words slipped past Victor's defenses before he could stop them. His chest tightened. "You don't know anything about me." The man nodded slowly. "I know you learned early that power feels safer than need. I know you closed doors because you were afraid of standing on the other side of them again." Victor stared at him. The cafe noise faded. "Who are you?" "Someone who saw the doors you shut," the man replied softly, "and the prayers you chose not to hear." A chill crept up Victor's spine. He remembered the steps, bare feet on stone, a rosary worn smooth by time. He stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. "Listen, I don't know what game you're playing." The man placed a hand on the table. Not forcefully, comfortingly. The touch stopped Victor mid-sentence. "You've mistaken control for strength," the man said, "and order for righteousness." Victor's anger faltered, replaced by something more dangerous: recognition. "Why is this happening to me?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Why is everything falling apart?" The man met his gaze. "Because the life you built was protecting you from remembering who you promised to be." Before Victor could ask what that meant, the man stood. "Wait," Victor said quickly. "You can't just—" But the man was already walking toward the door. Outside, sunlight cut across the street. Victor followed, heart pounding. The sidewalk was empty. No sign of him. No sound of footsteps. Just passing strangers who hadn't noticed anything at all. Victor stood frozen, the echo of the man's words pressing into him like a weight. That night, lying awake in a house that suddenly felt too large, Victor replayed the moment again and again, the calm voice, the knowing eyes, the strange peace that had unsettled him more than fear ever could. He did not yet allow himself to name who the man was, but deep inside something had shifted. And for the first time since the collapse began, Victor Langford wondered if what he was losing might be the very thing standing between him and the truth. The memories came that night, uninvited and relentless. Victor Langford sat alone in his study, the house silent except for the low hum of distant traffic. The man from the cafe would not leave his thoughts. The doors you shut, the prayers you chose not to hear. The words peeled back years Victor had sealed away, dragging him to a time when he had been small, hungry, and invisible. He had not grown up powerful. Long before the hotels and tailored suits, Victor was a barefoot boy himself, raised on the outskirts of town, in a cramped apartment where winter crept through the walls. His father worked until his hands cracked and bled. His mother rationed meals with quiet precision, pretending she wasn't hungry so her son could eat. When Victor was 10, his mother fell ill. It began with a cough, then fever, then breath that came in shallow, painful bursts. They waited too long, hoping it would pass. It didn't. One evening, desperate and shaking, Victor's father took him by the hand and walked to the largest house in the neighborhood, the home of a man everyone said was generous. Victor remembered the polished door, the warm light spilling from the windows, the smell of expensive cigars when it opened. They begged. They explained. They promised repayment through labor, through years if necessary. The man listened with detached impatience, eyes flicking over Victor's worn clothes, his mother's gray face. Then he laughed a short, dismissive sound and told them poverty was not his responsibility. He closed the door before Victor could speak. The echo of that door stayed with Victor longer than his mother did. She died 3 days later. At the funeral, Victor did not cry. Something else happened instead. A decision formed sharp and absolute. He would never kneel again, never ask, never be weak. If doors could be closed so easily, he would learn to be the one holding the keys. Years passed. Victor worked harder than anyone around him. He studied, sacrificed, calculated. Success came not gently, but violently. Each achievement reinforced the vow he had made as a child. Power replaced prayer. Control replaced trust. And slowly, without noticing, Victor began to treat need as a flaw, dependence as failure, poverty as something to be kept at a distance. Now, sitting in the dim light of his study, Victor covered his face with his hands. The memory sharpened painfully as another image followed it. Grace Holloway, barefoot on the church steps, the same bowed head, the same desperation, the same closed door. The realization struck him with brutal clarity. He had become the man he once despised. The boy who watched a door close on his dying mother had grown into the man who closed doors on others. Not out of hatred, but out of fear, a fear so old and buried he had mistaken it for strength. Tears slipped through Victor's fingers, falling onto the polished desk. For the first time, he understood that the cruelty he justified was not born from confidence, but from an unhealed wound. And until that wound was faced, every door he touched would continue to shut on others and on himself. Victor Langford returned to St. Raphael Parish at dusk, when the town had grown quiet and the tourists were gone. The stone steps were cool beneath the fading light, and for a moment he stood at the bottom, unsure whether he had the right to climb them. Then he saw her. Grace Holloway sat where she always did, hands folded rosary resting against her thin coat, bare feet drawn close together as if to make herself smaller. She looked up when she sensed someone nearby, her body tensing, not in anger, but in expectation of being told to leave once more. Victor did not speak right away. He walked up slowly and sat down on the steps beside her, leaving a careful space between them. The silence that followed was different from the ones that had filled the church before. This one waited. Grace studied his face. She saw no authority there now, no sharpness, only exhaustion. "I'm not here to send you away," Victor said at last, his voice rough. "I'm here because I owe you something." Grace said nothing. She waited. "This is God's house," he continued, eyes fixed on the ground. "Not mine. I forgot that. I acted like the doors belonged to me." His hands trembled slightly. "I had no right to close them on you." The words seemed to take effort, as if each one had to pass through something broken before it could be spoken. Grace's expression softened, not with triumph, but with understanding. She had seen that look before in widows and grieving parents, in people who had lost more than they knew how to name. "I came here to pray," she said gently, "not to cause trouble." "I know," Victor replied, his voice cracked. "And I punished you for it." He swallowed hard. "I forgot what it feels like to stand on the other side of a door. I forgot what it means to ask and be turned away." Grace looked down at her rosary, then back at him. "We all forget sometimes," she said, "especially when life teaches us to be afraid." Victor's shoulders sagged. "I became someone I promised myself I would never be." Grace reached out, then her hand light but steady resting on his. The touch startled him, not because it was unwelcome, but because it carried no bitterness. "God doesn't work with what we deserve," she said quietly. "He works with what we need." Victor closed his eyes. The words broke through something he had guarded for decades. Tears slid down his face, unhidden and unrestrained. He did not wipe them away. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he whispered. Grace smiled, a small, tired smile filled with mercy. "Maybe not," she said. But forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about healing. They sat together as the sun dipped lower, two lives intersecting on cold stone. Passers-by might have seen nothing remarkable, just an old woman and a man in a rumpled jacket. But on those steps, something far heavier than words had shifted. The door that mattered most had not been the one behind them. It was the one opening quietly inside Victor Langford's heart. The change did not come quietly, but it came honestly. 2 weeks after Victor Langford sat on the church steps and asked forgiveness, the members of St. Raphael Parish's council gathered in a small meeting room behind the sanctuary. They arrived uneasy, whispering among themselves, expecting Victor to ask for help or worse, to leverage what power he had left. They did not expect what he said next. "I'm stepping down," Victor announced, his voice steady, but stripped of authority. Effective immediately. The room fell silent. One member leaned forward. "Victor, are you sure you've carried this parish for years?" "That's the problem," Victor replied. "I carried it like it was mine." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were revised policies, simple, direct, uncompromising. No dress codes, no appearance requirements, no exclusions. The doors of St. Raphael Parish would remain open to anyone who wished to pray rich or poor, clean or broken, barefoot or dressed in silk. A murmur spread through the room. Someone mentioned donors. Someone else mentioned tourists. Victor listened, then shook his head. "This is not a museum," he said. "It's not a brand. It's the house of Jesus Christ. And if he would sit beside the poor, then so will this church." Father Thomas stood slowly, his hands trembling. "I need to say something," he said, his voice thick. "I preached love while allowing fear to rule my actions. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. That ends today." One by one, the objections fell away, not because everyone agreed, but because no one could deny the truth in the room. The vote passed. The following morning, Grace Holloway approached the church just before sunrise, as she always had. She stopped short, uncertain. The door stood open. No guards, no warnings, no barriers. Father Thomas was there, waiting. "Good morning, Grace," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "Welcome home." She stepped inside slowly, as if afraid the moment might vanish. The warmth of the sanctuary wrapped around her, and tears slipped down her cheeks as she knelt in the first pew. For the first time in months, her prayer rose without resistance. From the back of the church, Victor watched quietly. He no longer sat in the front. He no longer belonged there. His suit was gone, replaced by simple clothes and tired hands. What remained was something unfamiliar and lighter. The cost of the decision became clear quickly. Donations declined. Contracts dissolved. Victor's properties were seized one by one. His name faded from headlines and guest lists. He moved into a small apartment with bare walls and no reminders of who he used to be. But every morning the church doors opened. People came who had never been welcomed before, mothers with restless children, men who smelled of the street, elderly women with trembling hands and worn shoes. Some prayed, some cried, some simply sat in the quiet. Victor cleaned floors. Ethan handed out hymnals. Father Thomas listened more than he spoke. Nothing about the change was easy. Everything about it was real. And as the doors of St. Raphael Parish opened wider than they ever had before, it became clear that Victor Langford had not lost his life. He had finally given it back. The church was empty when it happened. Late one evening, long after the last candle had burned low, Victor Langford moved quietly between the pews, straightening hymnals and stacking chairs the way he did every night. The work was simple, honest. It grounded him. The echo of his footsteps felt softer now, less accusing than it once had. Then he sensed he was no longer alone. At the front of the sanctuary near the altar, a figure stood where there had been nothing moments before. A man dressed plainly in a white robe, unadorned and radiant without shining. The light around him was not blinding. It was gentle like dawn, filtering through stained glass. Victor's hands went slack. The chair slipped from his grip and struck the floor. The man looked at him with eyes that carried infinite patience. "Victor," he said softly. Victor's knees gave way. He fell to the stone floor, not from fear, but from recognition, so overwhelming it emptied his strength. Every word he had rehearsed vanished. Only truth remained. "I know who you are," Victor whispered, tears spilling freely. "And I know what I did. I closed the doors of your house. I turned away the ones you love. I was cruel. I was afraid. Jesus Christ knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulders. The touch was warm, steady, real. I know, Jesus said. I know what you did. And I know why you did it. Victor's breath hitched. Why? Because you were afraid of becoming the child who begged for help and was refused. Jesus answered gently. You mistook power for safety, control for strength, and in protecting yourself from pain, you closed yourself to love. Victor sobbed openly now. I forgot who I promised to be. Jesus nodded. When you were a boy, you asked God to save your mother. You promised that if he did, you would spend your life helping others. She died, Victor said brokenly. I thought I wasn't heard. You were heard, Jesus replied. Every prayer, every tear. Her time had come, but I was with her, and I never left you. I waited for you to remember. Victor pressed his forehead to the floor. I wasted so much time. Jesus lifted his chin. No time given to love is ever wasted, and it is not too late. Silence filled the sanctuary, not the heavy silence of judgment, but the quiet of healing. When Victor looked up again, Jesus was already standing. Why did you let me meet Grace? Victor asked. Jesus smiled. Because she carries the faith your mother carried. I placed her on your path so you could open the door that was once closed to you. Tears streamed down Victor's face. I'm sorry. You are forgiven, Jesus said. Now live differently. With that, the light softened. When Victor blinked, the sanctuary was empty once more, but the air felt changed, alive with peace. The years that followed bore quiet fruit. Victor never regained his wealth. He never sought it. Instead, he helped turn the church steps into a community table, serving breakfast every morning. Grace Holloway volunteered beside him. Sophie grew strong, went on to study nursing, her education, supported by scholarships Victor helped organize. St. Raphael Parish became known not for its beauty, but for its open doors. When Victor died decades later, the church overflowed not with donors or dignitaries, but with the poor, the forgotten, the welcomed. At his grave, someone placed a pair of worn shoes, the first ones he had ever given Grace, a symbol of doors once closed and finally open. This story reminds us that the most dangerous doors are not made of wood or stone, but of fear, pride, and unresolved wounds. Victor did not become cruel because he was evil. He became cruel because he was hurt, and he chose control over compassion. In our own lives, we often do the same. We protect our image, our comfort, or our status, while quietly turning away from someone who simply needs to be seen. Jesus Christ teaches us that faith is not proven by appearances, rules, or power, but by how we treat the least among us when no one is watching. Every act of mercy opens a door, not just for others, but within our own hearts. If this message spoke to you, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story of grace and transformation. Share this video with someone who may need encouragement today, and leave a comment below telling us what door is God calling you to open.